Why did one Green Beret sergeant rack up an enemy kill count in 38 hours that most infantry companies couldn't achieve in months? How did a farm boy from Oklahoma survive 18 separate wounds while fighting off 2 North Vietnamese army regiments? What made Camp A Shau so strategically vital that the enemy committed over 2,000 troops to overrun 17 Americans? And why did it take nearly 50 years for Bennie Adkins to receive the Medal of Honor for what the Army called the most intense close combat action of the early Vietnam War? You're going to hear the complete story of how Sergeant First Class Bennie Adkins became a one-man army in the remote A Shau Valley, fighting with every weapon he could get his hands on while mortars exploded around him, dragging wounded comrades to safety and then leading survivors through 2 days of jungle evasion that included an encounter with a 400-pound tiger. Bennie Jean Adkins was born on February 1st, 1934, in Waurika, Oklahoma, a small farming community where hard work wasn't optional. Growing up on that farm in the 1930s and 40s, young Bennie learned self-reliance the old-fashioned way, doing physical labor from sunup to sundown, hunting to put food on the table, and making decisions that could mean the difference between a good harvest and a failed one. He didn't know it then, but that rural childhood was building exactly the kind of mental toughness and physical endurance he'd need in the jungles of Vietnam. When his draft notice arrived in 1956, Adkins was 22 years old. Unlike many draftees who resented military service, Adkins saw opportunity. After completing initial training at Fort Bliss, Texas, he was assigned as an administrative clerk typist to a garrison unit in Gießen, Germany. Now you might wonder how a clerk typist in Germany became one of the most decorated soldiers in Special Forces history. Following his assignment in Germany, Adkins moved to the 2nd Infantry Division at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he attended airborne school and volunteered for Special Forces in 1961. That decision changed everything. Adkins later explained his motivation simply. He wanted to be the best soldier he could possibly be. Special Forces training in the early 1960s was brutally demanding. Over the next 13 years, he served with the 7th, 3rd, 6th, and 5th Special Forces groups, learning languages, advanced weapons systems, unconventional warfare tactics, and survival skills that would prove invaluable. Adkins' first tour in Vietnam lasted from February to August 1963, followed by his second tour from September 1965 to September 1966. It was during that second tour that everything culminated in the A Shau Valley. But before we get to March 1966, you need to understand what Camp A Shau was and why the North Vietnamese were willing to sacrifice hundreds of men to destroy it. The A Shau Special Forces camp sat in a narrow valley, about 30 miles southwest of Hue and just 2 kilometers east of the Laos border, positioned directly astride a critical junction of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This wasn't just another outpost. This was a strategic choke point where the enemy's main infiltration route brought troops and supplies from Laos into the populated coastal areas around Hue and Da Nang. The camp had been established back in 1963, and by early 1966, 2 other South Vietnamese camps in the valley at Aloi and Ta Bat had already been abandoned in December 1965. Camp A Shau was the last American presence in the entire valley, a thorn in the side of North Vietnamese logistics operations. The enemy wanted it gone. On the eve of the attack, the garrison consisted of 17 Green Berets, 6 South Vietnamese Special Forces troops, and 210 South Vietnamese civilian irregulars, though Blair was fortunate to receive 143 ethnic Chinese Nung mercenaries as reinforcements just before the attack. The Nungs were better trained and more reliable fighters than many of the irregular forces. Sergeant First Class Bennie Adkins was serving as the intelligence sergeant with Detachment A102, 5th Special Forces Group, 1st Special Forces. Now here's where the story gets tense. On March 5th, 2 PAVN defectors showed up at the camp and under interrogation revealed that 4 battalions of the PAVN 325th Division were planning to attack. Think about those numbers for a moment. 4 battalions meant roughly 2,000 enemy soldiers against fewer than 400 defenders, most of whom were irregulars of questionable reliability. Night patrols were dispatched to confirm enemy positions but found nothing. However, air commandos conducting reconnaissance flights observed large build-ups of PAVN troops, along with anti-aircraft emplacements. The North Vietnamese weren't hiding anymore. They were preparing a massive coordinated assault, and they had surrounded the valley with anti-aircraft guns on the hilltops to create a killing zone for any aircraft that tried to help. At about 3 in the morning on March 9, 1966, the camp was attacked by 2 reinforced North Vietnamese army regiments and Viet Cong. The attack began with a barrage of mortar fire, 82mm and 120mm mortars raining down on the small triangular camp. Adkins rushed through intense enemy fire and manned a mortar position, continually adjusting fire for the camp, despite incurring wounds as the mortar pit received several direct hits from enemy mortars. Imagine being in an open mortar pit with incoming rounds bracketing your position, knowing that staying there means almost certain death, but also knowing your comrades depend on that fire support. Adkins stayed at that mortar position even as it took direct hits that wounded him and killed others around him. Upon learning that several soldiers were wounded near the centre of camp, he temporarily turned the mortar over to another soldier, ran through exploding mortar rounds, and dragged several comrades to safety. This became a pattern throughout the battle. Adkins would be performing one critical task, learn of another emergency, sprint through enemy fire to deal with it, then return to his original position. As hostile fire briefly subsided, Adkins repeatedly exposed himself to sniper and mortar fire while moving casualties to the camp dispensary. The camp medic, Staff Sergeant Billy Hall, was himself severely wounded early in the fighting. Hall had both legs blown off by a mortar round, but he continued instructing South Vietnamese forces on how to treat the wounded until he died from blood loss. Adkins would later say that Hall deserved the Medal of Honor, but was only awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The battle intensified throughout the day. Adkins and his group came under heavy small arms fire from members of the Civilian Irregular Defense Group, who had defected to fight with the North Vietnamese, but despite this overwhelming force, Adkins maneuvered outside the camp to evacuate a seriously wounded American and draw fire away from the aircraft, all the while successfully covering the rescue. You need to understand how psychologically devastating this was. Some of the indigenous troops they had trained and fought alongside suddenly turned their weapons on the Americans. It created chaos and paranoia because you couldn't tell friend from enemy among the Vietnamese forces. Meanwhile, Air Force A-1 Sky Raiders were attempting to provide close air support, but the weather was terrible and enemy anti-aircraft fire was devastating. During the day, an A-1 piloted by Major D.W. Myers was hit and forced to crash land on the A Shau airstrip 200 meters from PAVN positions. Adkins said he fired mortars all around Myers' position to protect the pilot from capture, and Adkins and another Special Forces soldier, Master Sergeant Victor Underwood, were injured during that battle to protect the downed airmen. The pilot of the 2nd A-1E, Major Bernard Fisher, landed in extreme enemy fire and evacuated Myers, and Fisher received the Medal of Honor for that action. 2 Medal of Honor actions happening simultaneously at the same location gives you some sense of how intense this fighting was. When a resupply airdrop landed outside of the camp perimeter, Adkins again moved outside of the camp walls to retrieve the much-needed supplies. The camp was surrounded by minefields that the defenders had laid for protection, but those minefields also meant that recovering supplies dropped outside the wire required maneuvering through areas the Americans had booby-trapped themselves. Adkins made multiple trips outside the perimeter under fire to bring back ammunition and medical supplies. During the early morning hours of March the 10th, enemy forces launched their main assault, and within 2 hours, Sergeant First Class Adkins was the only defender firing a mortar weapon, and when all mortar rounds were expended, Adkins began placing effective rifle fire upon enemy as they infiltrated the camp perimeter. Think about what this means. The enemy's main assault came on the second morning, a massive human wave attack designed to overwhelm the exhausted defenders. Every other American who knew how to operate a mortar was either dead, wounded, or pinned down elsewhere. Adkins was firing the mortar alone, adjusting his own fire, loading and firing as fast as he could until he ran completely out of ammunition. Then he didn't retreat to a bunker. He grabbed a recoilless rifle and continued engaging enemy positions. When that ran low on ammunition, he used machine guns. When those ran dry, he fought with his rifle and hand grenades. During the 38-hour battle and 48 hours of escape and evasion, fighting with mortars, machine guns, recoilless rifles, small arms and hand grenades, it was estimated that Sergeant First Class Adkins killed between 135 and 175 of the enemy, while sustaining 18 different wounds to his body. Now you may wonder how the army arrived at that specific estimate of 135 to 175 enemy killed. In combat, especially in the chaos of a battle like a Shau, it's difficult to get precise body counts. But multiple surviving Americans witnessed Adkins' actions throughout the battle and provided testimony. If you watched until here, I'd be happy if you liked the video and subscribed to my channel. The intelligence sergeant kept mental notes of enemy movements and casualties. After-action reports documented bodies found in and around positions Adkins had defended. The number isn't propaganda or exaggeration. It's a conservative estimate based on documented observations from multiple sources. The enemy suffered 500 to 800 total casualties, while the camp had 200 soldiers killed and 100 wounded. That means Adkins personally accounted for somewhere between 1/5 and 1/3 of all enemy casualties over those 38 hours. Let's talk about the 18 wounds. These weren't minor scratches. Adkins was hit by shrapnel from mortar rounds multiple times. He took small arms fire. He was blown out of the mortar pit by near misses. Some wounds were serious enough that in a normal combat situation, he would have been immediately evacuated. But there was no evacuation. There was only the fight. Adkins continued operating despite blood loss, despite pain, despite injuries that would have incapacitated most men. Other Green Berets at Camp A Shau fought just as heroically. Specialist 5 Philip Stahl was wounded early in the battle, had been tagged to be medevaced earlier but elected to stay, and he died on a machine gun. Sergeant Owen McCann left his communications bunker to repel the enemy and was shot and killed. Sergeant Jimmy Taylor was severely wounded and was carried away from Camp A Shau to be evacuated but died in the jungle. Sergeant First Class Raymond Allen was killed in one of the early mortar attacks. 5 Americans died at Camp A Shau. Every member of the unit was killed or wounded, every single one. This wasn't a situation where some people fought while others stayed safe. This was total commitment, total sacrifice. By the afternoon of March 10th, the situation had become untenable. Ammunition was running short and the decision was made to evacuate all personnel, and at 5 p.m. all communication equipment was destroyed. The evacuation itself was a nightmare. 15 H-34 helicopters from HMM-163, supported by 4 UH-1B gunships, attempted the extraction, but panic-stricken South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians mobbed the evacuation helicopters and overwhelmed US Special Forces troops as they abandoned the camp, reaching a point where the helicopters were so overloaded that some Special Forces soldiers were forced to fire upon their allies to allow the helicopters to take off. This is one of the most tragic aspects of the battle that veterans don't like talking about. American soldiers had to shoot South Vietnamese troops who were clinging to the helicopters, preventing takeoff. It was shoot a few to save the many, or let everyone die when the overloaded helicopter crashed. Only 172 of 368 Nguyen and Vietnamese irregulars were flown out, and the others were listed as MIA, although many would turn up later having escaped on their own. After being ordered to evacuate the camp, Sergeant First Class Adkins and a small group of soldiers destroyed all signal equipment and classified documents, dug their way out of the rear of the bunker and fought their way out of the camp. And while carrying a wounded soldier to the extraction point, he learned that the last helicopter had already departed. Adkins and his group had stayed behind to deny the enemy intelligence, carrying out their demolition tasks while the last helicopters lifted off. When they reached the landing zone with their wounded, they found it empty. The extraction was over. They were alone in enemy-controlled territory with North Vietnamese troops swarming the area. Sergeant First Class Adkins led the group while evading the enemy until they were rescued by helicopter on March 12, 1966. This began 48 hours of escape and evasion that tested every survival skill Adkins had learned in Special Forces training. The group consisted of Americans and some loyal South Vietnamese troops, all wounded to varying degrees, moving through triple canopy jungle in mountainous terrain, pursued by an enemy force that knew the area intimately. They had limited ammunition, limited food, limited medical supplies. Every sound could be an enemy patrol. Every clearing was potentially a kill zone. Adkins, despite his 18 wounds, took charge because he was the most experienced at land navigation and had the clearest head. They moved at night when possible, hiding during the day, constantly changing direction to throw off pursuit. The jungle itself was trying to kill them. Leeches, insects, poisonous snakes, the constant dampness that led to infected wounds. The group was leaving a blood trail that trackers could follow. On the second night in the jungle, something extraordinary happened that probably saved their lives. Adkins explained, the North Vietnamese soldiers had surrounded them on a little hilltop. Everything started getting quiet, and all they could see were some eyes going around them. Then a tiger stalked them that night because they were all bloody, and the tiger probably was attracted to that. But the North Vietnamese were more afraid of the tiger than of them, so they backed off some, and the group escaped because the tiger was on their side. Now that sounds almost too incredible to believe, but multiple survivors confirmed this account. An Indonesian tiger, probably weighing around 400 pounds, was drawn to the smell of blood from the wounded Americans and Vietnamese. The tiger circled their position, its eyes reflecting in the darkness. The North Vietnamese soldiers, being local to the area, knew exactly how dangerous these tigers were, and backed away from the hilltop rather than risk an encounter with the animal. As soon as the enemy pulled back, Adkins led his group in a different direction, putting distance between themselves and both the tiger and the NVA. It's one of those strange twists of fate that happen in war. The tiger that could have killed them instead saved them. On March 12th, the survivors of Camp A Shau were finally rescued by helicopter. Imagine the relief when they heard those rotor blades in the distance, when the helicopter descended through the jungle canopy, when they lifted off knowing they had survived something that should have killed them all. Adkins had been awake and fighting for essentially 4 straight days, wounded 18 times, had killed between 135 and 175 enemy soldiers, saved numerous American lives, led a successful evasion through enemy territory, and returned alive. Looking back on the battle, Adkins said it was the toughest he could recall, adding that it was just not his time to die, despite being blown from mortar pits on several occasions. After the Americans abandoned Camp A Shau, the PAV transformed the A Shau Valley into a heavily fortified base area, with bunkers, anti-aircraft guns and artillery, and US and South Vietnamese forces were unable to re-establish a permanent presence in the valley for the remainder of the war. This was the strategic consequence of losing Camp A Shau. The North Vietnamese now controlled a critical infiltration corridor that allowed them to move troops and supplies toward Hue and the coastal population centres virtually unopposed. During the Tet Offensive in 1968, the A Shau Valley provided PAVN and Viet Cong troops an important sanctuary from which to launch attacks on South Vietnamese cities and military bases, especially Hue and Phu Bai. The fall of Camp A Shau had strategic ramifications that affected the entire war. The US military launched several major operations trying to retake the valley. Operation Delaware in April 1968, Operation Somerset Plain in August 1968, Operation Dewey Canyon in March 1969, and Operation Apache Snow in May 1969, which culminated in the infamous Battle of Hamburger Hill. All of these operations were attempts to regain control that the loss of Camp A Shau had surrendered. So while Adkins and the other defenders fought heroically and inflicted massive casualties on the enemy, the strategic objective was ultimately lost. But that wasn't their fault. They were 17 Green Berets and a few hundred poorly trained irregulars trying to hold a camp against a division-sized enemy force with no possibility of reinforcement or relief. The fact that any of them survived is remarkable. Now here's where the story takes a frustrating turn. Adkins was initially awarded a Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during the first week of March 1966. The Distinguished Service Cross is the second highest military decoration just below the Medal of Honor. It's a prestigious award that recognizes extraordinary heroism, but many people who reviewed Adkins' case believed his actions clearly met the standard for the Medal of Honor. So why didn't he receive it in 1966 or 1967? There are several theories. Some believe it was simply lost in the fog of war, that the paperwork and witness statements didn't make it through the bureaucratic chain properly. Others suggest there were prejudices involved when looking at who was and wasn't recognized after Vietnam, noting that some folks were of a different race, some were a certain religion, and some were from the South, and it may have been because Benny was a Southern boy. There may have been subtle prejudice against Special Forces soldiers who operated in remote areas without conventional leadership watching their actions. There's also the uncomfortable reality that the Battle of Camp A Shau was ultimately a defeat. The camp was overrun and abandoned. Sometimes in military culture, defeats don't generate the same recognition as victories, even when the soldiers involved fight heroically. Whatever the reason, Bennie Adkins went about his life with the Distinguished Service Cross and didn't publicly complain about the Medal of Honor. He completed his final Vietnam tour from January through December 1971, serving with the Studies and Observation Group, the classified unit that ran cross-border operations into Laos and Cambodia. Adkins retired from the army in 1978 after 22 years of service. After retirement, Adkins didn't rest on his military laurels. He earned a bachelor's degree and 2 master's degrees from Troy State University, operated his own accounting company, and taught classes at Southern Union Junior College and Auburn University. He built a successful civilian career, raised a family, and became a respected member of his community in Opelika, Alabama. His wife Mary had lived through the anxiety of his Vietnam service, often without knowing where he was or whether he was alive. She saw a television report about a battle involving special forces in Vietnam in March 1966, and had a terrible feeling it might be her husband, but she received no official word for days. Military spouses carry their own burden of service. From 2002, the US Army reviewed all 6,500 recipients of the Distinguished Service Cross to see if any recipients had actually performed actions worthy of the Medal of Honor, and this led to 24 medal upgrades in March 2014. This review process was initiated to correct historical injustices and ensure that soldiers who deserved the nation's highest honor received it, even decades late. Adkins' case was championed by his former commander, Colonel John D. Blair, who had been the commanding officer at Camp A Shau. Blair never stopped believing that Adkins deserved the Medal of Honor and provided detailed testimony during the review process. In 2013, as part of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2014, the Senate Armed Service Committee passed a provision removing the time limit for Adkins and another soldier, and on September 15, 2014, President Obama awarded the Medal of Honor to Adkins as an upgrade of his 1967 Distinguished Service Cross. The ceremony at the White House was emotional for everyone present. Adkins was 80 years old, nearly 50 years removed from the battle. Every member of Adkins' unit had been either killed or wounded during the 48-hour ordeal, and 2 of the men he saved were able to attend the event. Seeing the men whose lives he saved, now elderly themselves, was profoundly moving. Bennie told President Obama that he owed everything to the men he served with in Vietnam, especially the 5 who gave their lives in that battle, and every member of his unit was killed or wounded, and every single one was recognized for their service. This humility is characteristic of Medal of Honor recipients. They almost universally deflect attention from themselves to their fallen comrades. When the citation was read aloud detailing the 135 to 175 enemy killed and 18 wounds sustained, there was a collective, audible gasp throughout the assembled crowd of friends, family, press, and members of the military in the East Room of the White House. Even people familiar with military heroism were stunned by the scope of what Adkins had done. After the ceremony, Adkins told the press what he would like to do is to be sure everyone knows that this Medal of Honor belongs to the other 16 Special Forces soldiers with him that day. He didn't think he was a hero, not really. He told another interviewer that what he did wasn't heroic, that he was just an average soldier, that it was his job, and he tries to tell young folks that whatever they want to do, be the best they can be at it. That's the mindset that created the warrior at Camp A Shau. Adkins didn't think of himself as exceptional. He thought he was doing what any good soldier would do in that situation. Of course, that's not true. Most soldiers, even good ones, wouldn't have survived what Adkins endured, much less accomplished what he did. But his humility reflects a generation of warriors who didn't seek glory or recognition. They did their duty because it was their duty. The Medal of Honor ceremony brought closure not just for Adkins, but for all the survivors of Camp A Shau and the families of those who died there. It was public recognition that what happened in that remote valley in March 1966 mattered, that their sacrifice wasn't forgotten, that America remembered. Now let's talk about the broader context of Special Forces operations in Vietnam and why Camp A Shau represents both the potential and the limitations of that mission. The Special Forces camps scattered along South Vietnam's borders with Laos and Cambodia were part of a strategy to interdict North Vietnamese infiltration routes. These camps were typically manned by a 12-man A-team of Green Berets, plus South Vietnamese Special Forces and several hundred civilian irregular defense group soldiers, often recruited from ethnic minorities like the Montagnards, Nungs, or Khmer Kampuchea Krom. The theory was that these small mobile forces could monitor enemy movement, conduct reconnaissance, and organize local resistance without requiring large numbers of conventional American troops. In practice, the strategy had mixed results. The CIDG forces were often poorly trained and equipped. Their loyalty was sometimes questionable, and they were no match for regular North Vietnamese army units. The camps were isolated, difficult to resupply, and impossible to reinforce quickly. When the enemy decided to mass forces against a camp, as they did at A Shau, the defenders were essentially on their own. Air support was weather-dependent and vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Quick reaction forces from conventional units couldn't reach remote camps fast enough. The Special Forces soldiers had to be prepared to fight outnumbered, surrounded, and with minimal support. That required a special breed of soldier. Bennie Adkins embodied that breed. His training with the 7th, 3rd, 6th, and 5th Special Forces groups had prepared him for independent operations, for thinking tactically under pressure, for using every weapon and tactic available. His Oklahoma farm background gave him the physical endurance and mental resilience to keep fighting when wounded and exhausted. His experience from his first Vietnam tour in 1963 gave him combat wisdom. All of those factors converged in the A Shau Valley in March 1966. But here's what often gets missed when we talk about extraordinary individual heroism. It doesn't change strategic outcomes. Adkins killed 135 to 175 enemy soldiers, an incredible achievement. The defenders inflicted somewhere between 500 and 800 total enemy casualties. The North Vietnamese paid a heavy price in blood for Camp A Shau. But they took the camp anyway and held the valley for the rest of the war. American forces launched multiple division-sized operations trying to retake the A Shau Valley over the next few years, operations that cost hundreds of American lives, and they never re-established permanent control. The valley remained a North Vietnamese base area, a sanctuary, a logistics hub. So does that diminish what Adkins and the other defenders did? Absolutely not. They weren't responsible for strategic decisions made at levels far above them. They were given a mission to defend Camp A Shau, and they executed that mission with skill and courage beyond what anyone could reasonably expect. They held out for 38 hours against overwhelming odds. They inflicted massive casualties on the enemy. They saved each other's lives repeatedly. They made the North Vietnamese pay dearly for every meter of ground. That's all you can ask of soldiers in combat. The uncomfortable truth about Vietnam that veterans understand is that tactical excellence and individual heroism often didn't translate into strategic success. You could win every firefight, kill 10 enemy soldiers for every American lost, control territory during the day, and still lose the war because the political and strategic fundamentals were flawed. That's not the soldiers' fault. Adkins and thousands like him did everything asked of them and more. They deserve to be remembered and honoured for their service regardless of how the war ended. The Medal of Honor citation for Bennie Adkins is lengthy and detailed because his actions over those 4 days in March 1966 included so many discrete acts of heroism. Let's walk through the timeline once more with attention to specific details that show the progression of the battle. 3 a.m., March 9th, 1966. The attack begins with mortar fire. Adkins rushes to man the mortar position. Early morning, March 9th. Adkins is wounded when the mortar pit takes direct hits but continues fighting. Morning, March 9th. He leaves the mortar to drag wounded soldiers to safety, then returns. Late morning, March 9th. Adkins moves wounded to the dispensary despite sniper fire. Midday, March 9th. Major Myers crashes his A-1 Sky Raider on the airstrip. Adkins fires mortars around Myers' position to protect him from capture while another pilot, Major Fisher, lands to rescue Myers. Afternoon, March 9th. Supply drop lands outside the perimeter. Adkins goes outside the wire through minefields to retrieve supplies. Evening, March 9th. First night of the battle. Continuous fighting. Early morning, March 10th. Enemy launches main assault. Adkins becomes the only defender firing a mortar. Morning, March 10th. Mortars expended. Adkins switches to recoilless rifle, then machine guns, then rifle and grenades. Afternoon, March 10th. Decision made to evacuate. Communications equipment destroyed. Adkins and small group destroy classified materials and fight their way out. Evening, March 10th. Extraction. Last helicopter departs before Adkins' group reaches the landing zone. Night of March 10th through March 11th. Evasion through jungle. Enemy in pursuit. Night of March 11th through March 12th. Tiger incident. Continued evasion. March 12th, 1966. Helicopter rescue. When you lay it out chronologically like that, the sustained intensity becomes clear. This wasn't one moment of heroism. It was 38 hours of continuous combat followed by 48 hours of life-or-death evasion. Most people couldn't maintain peak performance for 4 hours under those conditions. Adkins and the others did it for 4 days. The 18 wounds Adkins sustained weren't all at once. They accumulated over the battle. Shrapnel here, bullet graze there, blast concussion, more shrapnel. Each wound reduced his physical capability slightly, but he compensated through willpower and training. The human body has limits, and Adkins pushed far beyond what those limits should have. There's actually interesting medical research on how soldiers in combat can sustain injuries that would incapacitate them in normal circumstances but continue fighting due to adrenaline, focus, and training. The body essentially overrides its own pain and damage signals when survival is at stake. But that only works if the mind is strong enough to maintain focus and purpose. Weak-minded individuals collapse even from minor wounds. Adkins' mind was forged iron. Let's talk about the weapons Adkins used and his proficiency with them. The citation mentions mortars, machine guns, recoilless rifles, small arms, and hand grenades. That's basically every crew served an individual weapon available at the camp. The 81mm mortar was a complex weapon requiring a crew to operate effectively. One person to aim, another to load, others to prepare ammunition and adjust based on observed impacts. Adkins operated it alone under fire, adjusting his own fire, loading and firing. The 57mm recoilless rifle was designed as a two-man weapon, but Adkins fired it solo. Machine guns, whether the M60 or the older .30 caliber models, were crew-served weapons. Adkins used them as individual weapons. This versatility came from Special Forces training, which cross-trained soldiers on every weapon they might encounter. But training only gets you so far. Applying that training while wounded, exhausted, surrounded, and under fire requires a level of combat discipline that can't really be taught. You either have it or you don't, and Adkins had it. The hand-to-hand fighting that occurred when enemy troops breached the perimeter on March 10th is barely mentioned in the citations, but survivors described brutal close quarters, combat with knives, rifle butts, and fists when there was no time to reload. This was primal, desperate fighting, the kind that reveals who you are at the most fundamental level. Adkins was a warrior. Not in the Hollywood sense, but in the ancient sense of someone who fights to protect his brothers with absolute commitment. After receiving the Medal of Honor in 2014, Adkins spent his remaining years as an advocate for veterans and as a speaker sharing his experiences with young people. He emphasized values like dedication, doing your best at whatever job you have, and never giving up. He didn't glorify war or violence. He talked about duty, service, and the bonds formed between soldiers in combat. In March 2020, Adkins was hospitalized with COVID-19, admitted to the intensive care unit, and put on a ventilator after experiencing respiratory failure, and he died from complications of the virus on April 17, 2020, at the age of 86. And Adkins was buried at Arlington National Cemetery on December 16, 2020. The nation lost a genuine hero, but his story endures. There's a detail about Adkins that gets overlooked in the dramatic narrative of the battle. After the evacuation from A Shau, after recovering from his wounds, Adkins could have claimed medical retirement or taken a safe assignment for the remainder of his service. Instead, he returned for a third Vietnam tour from January through December 1971, this time with the Studies and Observation Group running classified missions across borders. He volunteered to go back into danger after nearly dying once. That tells you something profound about his character. He wasn't doing it for glory or recognition. He was doing it because his Special Forces brothers were still over there, still in danger, and he wanted to be with them. That's the kind of loyalty and commitment that defines the Special Forces community. The Studies and Observation Group missions Adkins ran in 1971 were arguably even more dangerous than the A Shau battle in some ways. SOG teams conducted reconnaissance and sabotage deep in enemy-controlled territory in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. They operated with no support, no possibility of quick extraction, and certain death or torture if captured. The casualty rates for SOG units were staggering, far higher than conventional units. Adkins volunteered for that knowing full well the risks because that's who he was. After finally retiring in 1978, he built a civilian life but remained connected to the veteran community. He attended reunions, mentored younger veterans, and never forgot his brothers who didn't come home. One aspect of Adkins' character that everyone who knew him mentioned was his humility. Even after receiving the Medal of Honor, he insisted on directing attention to the other soldiers at Camp A Shau. He named them specifically Philip Stahl, Owen McCann, Billy Hall, Jimmy Taylor, Raymond Allen, the 5 who died. He remembered Victor Underwood, who was wounded protecting Major Myers. He praised the South Vietnamese troops who stayed loyal and fought bravely alongside the Americans. He acknowledged the difficult decisions made by the helicopter crews during the chaotic evacuation. He understood that war is complicated, that heroism often requires impossible moral choices, and that judgment is easy from safety but hard in the moment. The Medal of Honor ceremony included several of the men Adkins had saved. Major John Bradford, whom Adkins had shielded in a helicopter during the battle. Major Wayne Murray, whom Adkins had saved from capture. Seeing these men, now elderly, alive because of Adkins' actions 50 years earlier, brought the abstract statistics to concrete reality. Those men had lived full lives, raised families, contributed to their communities, all because Bennie Adkins did his job at Camp A Shau. How many children and grandchildren exist because Adkins pulled a wounded soldier out of the kill zone? How many lives were touched by the men he saved? The ripple effects of heroism extend far beyond the immediate moment. Let's address the specific question posed in the title. How did Bennie Adkins kill 135 to 175 enemy soldiers in 38 hours? The answer combines several factors. First, target-rich environment. With 2,000 enemy troops attacking a small camp, there were always targets available. Second, weapons proficiency. Adkins was expert level with every weapon system available and used them efficiently. Third, tactical position. The defenders were in prepared positions with fields of fire designed to maximize defensive firepower. Fourth, enemy tactics. The North Vietnamese used massed infantry assaults that, while effective in overwhelming defenses, also presented concentrated targets. Fifth, sustained engagement. Most combat involves brief firefights followed by lulls. The A Shau battle was essentially continuous for 38 hours. Sixth, crew-served weapons, mortars, machine guns, and recoilless rifles, are designed to engage multiple targets rapidly. A properly aimed mortar round landing in an enemy assault formation can kill or wound dozens. A machine gun with good fields of fire can achieve very high casualty rates. Seventh, defensive amplification. Every enemy casualty made the next enemy advance more difficult, created gaps in their formations, reduced their combat effectiveness. Eighth, and perhaps most important, absolute focus. Adkins wasn't thinking about survival or going home. He was thinking about the next target, the next shot, the next task. That total immersion in the present moment is rare and extremely effective in combat. The comparison to other Medal of Honor actions is instructive. Sergeant Alvin York in World War I is credited with killing or capturing 132 German soldiers in a single engagement. Audie Murphy in World War II fought off an entire company of German infantry. Master Sergeant Roy Benavides in Vietnam sustained over 30 wounds during a 6-hour battle while rescuing a reconnaissance team. These are the outliers, the statistical anomalies, the warriors whose actions seem almost superhuman. Adkins belongs in that company. What he accomplished at Camp A Shau puts him among the most effective combat soldiers in American history, but he would deflect that praise and point to the team, to the circumstances, to luck. There's a broader lesson in Adkins' story about the nature of heroism. Popular culture often portrays heroes as fearless individuals who never doubt or hesitate. Real heroes, the ones who actually perform extraordinary acts, are usually ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances who decide to do their duty despite fear, despite doubt, despite wounds. Adkins was afraid during the A Shau battle. He's admitted as much in interviews. He thought he was going to die, but he kept fighting because his brothers needed him to fight. That's real heroism, doing what needs to be done despite being terrified. The absence of fear isn't courage. Courage is acting rightly despite fear. Adkins' Oklahoma farm background gets mentioned often because it shaped his character fundamentally. Growing up poor in the 1930s and 40s, doing physical labor, learning self-reliance, understanding that sometimes you just have to endure, those experiences created a baseline resilience that served him throughout his military career. Modern society, particularly in affluent areas, doesn't always teach that kind of toughness anymore. We've become more comfortable, more protected, which is generally good, but it means fewer people develop the kind of mental and physical resilience Adkins possessed. Military training tries to instill that resilience, but there's a difference between acquired toughness through training and inherent toughness from life experience. Adkins had both. The Special Forces community views Adkins as an exemplar of their values: unconventional thinking, versatility, physical and mental toughness, language and cultural skills, the ability to train and lead indigenous forces, and absolute commitment to the mission and the team. Every Special Forces soldier studies the A Shau battle as an example of what one determined NCO can accomplish in combat. The battle is also studied for its strategic lessons about the limits of the camp system, the challenges of defending isolated positions against superior forces, the importance of reliable indigenous troops, and the difficulty of providing effective air support in mountainous, jungle-covered terrain with heavy enemy air defences. As we conclude, it's worth reflecting on what Bennie Adkins represents to veterans, to historians, and to the American public. To veterans, especially Vietnam veterans, he represents vindication. He proved that American soldiers in Vietnam fought with extraordinary skill and courage, that they won their battles, that they deserve respect regardless of how the war ended politically. To historians, he represents a case study in individual combat effectiveness and leadership under extreme conditions. To the public, he represents the best of American military service. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things out of duty, loyalty, and love for their comrades. The title asks how Bennie Adkins killed 135 to 175 enemy soldiers in 38 hours. We've answered that question with details about weapons, tactics, circumstances, and the man himself. But perhaps the more important question is why? Why did he keep fighting when wounded? Why did he expose himself to fire to save others? Why did he volunteer for a third tour? Why did he remain humble after receiving the Medal of Honor? The answer to all those questions is the same: character. Bennie Adkins was a man of exceptional character, forged through hard early life, refined through military training, and tested through combat. He passed every test and emerged as an example for future generations. Bennie Jean Adkins, February 1st, 1934 to April 17th, 2020, was a United States Army soldier and recipient of the U.S. military's highest decoration, the Medal of Honor, for his actions during the Vietnam War. He was also a Bear's husband, father, grandfather, teacher, accountant, and friend. He lived a full life of service and contribution. The 38 hours at Camp A Shau were just a small part of his 86 years, but they revealed who he was at his core: a warrior, a leader, a man who put others before himself. Rest in peace, Command Sergeant Major Bennie Adkins. Your fight is over. If you watched we have the watch here, now. I'd be happy if you liked the video and subscribe to my channel.